and welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I am your host, Taylor Rockwell. No Daryl Grove in studio with me today. If you did not listen to yesterday's show, I would suggest doing so because we discussed kind of where Daryl has been and what the future holds for Daryl. I know that sounds slightly ominous if you don't know what I'm talking about, which is why I'm saying you should listen to it. If you've already listened to it, then just know that Daryl is doing very well, remains positive. We're all very positive here. We hugged a bunch yesterday. Today, though, I'm going to be talking to David Amoyal of the CalcioLand Podcast, as well as The Athletic and ESPN. David is an expert on Serie A. That will become abundantly clear in the very near future, but I'm kind of treating this as a catch-up. We haven't covered Serie A much. I mentioned that a few times in the upcoming interview. So I wanted to kind of look at what's been going on, what the trends have been, who's on the move, who's not going to be on the move. I'm recording this introduction on the day the transfer window closes. David and I recorded this interview on Tuesday afternoon evening. So maybe a few things have happened in that time period. Maybe a few things will happen after I hit publish, but that's the nature of the beast. That said, we're scheduled to have a special guest joining us on the show tomorrow to discuss the transfer window, such as it was, as well as maybe taking a quick look at the U.S. men's national team's upcoming game against Costa Rica. But right now, David and I are going to talk Serie A. We're going to talk a bunch of different teams. It's not just the big ones. It's not just an hour of Juve. I promise you that. So, without any more rambling from me, here is David Amoyal talking Serie A. With me now, via the magic of the internet, I've got David Amoyal of the CalcioLand Podcast, as well as The Athletic and ESPN. David, thanks for taking the time to join me this evening.
A real pleasure to be on. Thanks so much for having me on to chat about Serie A. Always great to plug the league here in the U.S.
Of course, and it's a league that we haven't talked about as much this season, so I'm excited to rectify that. I had initially thought we might just discuss a few Serie A topics, and that would be it. I've been reading your stuff for The Athletic. It's legitimately excellent, and it also means that I now have 400 questions for you. So I hope you've got some time.
Absolutely.
All right.
I'm ready to go.
All right. Well, then let's get to it. Starting with, I'm going to start with Inter Milan, actually, because I know you all discussed the possible transfer of Ivan Perisic from Inter Milan to Arsenal on your podcast. I wanted to ask, what's the latest there? And maybe more specifically, what has happened with Ivan Perisic? Because he's a player who obviously performed very well in the World Cup, and he was linked with a number of big clubs. It felt like he was kind of on the way up, and now it seems like maybe he's gone downhill a little bit this season.
So I'm a big fan of his, and I agree with you. I thought he was brilliant in the World Cup. I think with Mandzukic and Modric were really the drivers behind Croatia's great run. And, previously at Inter, he has been known as a pretty moody player, absolutely devastating winger on his day, but sometimes would take a few games off. But since coming back from the World Cup, that has been more than a few games off. I think his great performances have been few and far in between. I think, for Perisic at Inter, the team has been spending a lot more. They are giving bigger contracts to some of their key players. I think Perisic tried to get a raise and was told, not right now, not with the way you are playing. So I think, between that and the fact that he is about to turn 30, Inter kind of sees this at the last opportunity to get a pretty big return for him. So, with Arsenal, it started a little bit late in the game. Arsenal's pretty hamstrung. They can only really do loan deals. Inter's more interested in a straight sale. So as it stands now and the window's about to close, I would say the odds of him leaving for Arsenal, I'd say maybe 30, 35%, not more. I think Inter has to hope he has a great second half to get his market back up in the summer.
That makes sense to me. But you mentioned there that they're starting to spend a little bit more money. They're throwing out some better contracts. It does seem like Inter are linked with every player, specifically every player who's about to be out of contract this summer, and as a few managers who might be looking for new employment. I personally was convinced that the signing of Godin meant, or the possible signing, I guess, of Godin indicated that Simeone might be coming, but maybe I'm wrong there. So I wanted to ask also what the situation at Inter is and how likely we are to see a new manager next season.
Yeah, so great question. Godin, I think, is quite the coup for Inter, especially because they are already very strong at the center back position. They signed on another Bosman signing the year before, De Vrij from Lazio, a highly rated player. They already have Milan Skriniar, one of the best young center backs in the world. And I think having Godin in the mix gives them flexibility with Skriniar. They can entertain a huge offer for him or go with a devastating back three As far as the manager position, I definitely could see how Godin could be the appetizer for Simeone arriving. Simeone has ties to Inter. He has not been shy about saying that he would like to coach him someday. I'm not sure if this is going to happen quite yet. We know Simeone has strong ties to Atletico Madrid as well. I think it really comes down to either Antonio Conte or Simeone next season. I think their current manager, Spalletti, has to either win a trophy, the Europa League especially, or have a very convincing end to the season, get back to the Champions League for a second year in a row. Inter had been out for 6 years. But, I always like to say it's easy to sack the coach, harder to find someone better. But I think Simeone and Conte fall under the category that they are better. So if Inter thinks they have a legitimate shot at either one, we could see a switch there. So I would say Spalletti, maybe 30% chance of coming back, with Simeone and Conte kind of dividing the rest of the percentage.
And does Jose Mourinho get any of that percentage, or do you think that's more so maybe his camp leaking that everybody's interested in him, when in reality maybe Inter not on the cards?
So, look, Inter fans are always going to adore Mourinho because of the treble. I think there was some momentum for him before he went to Manchester United. I think the way things ended there, and this being another club where he ends on bad terms and the replacement comes in and does so much better, I'm not sure there's a lot of appetite for another reunion with Inter. I think the old owner, the one Massimo Moratti, who was there when Mourinho was the coach and they won the treble, if he was still in charge, I think Mourinho would have been hired the day after he was let go at Manchester United. I think the new owner is a little bit more pragmatic, and I think they see Conte and Simeone as clearly better options at this point.
And I wanted to ask, because I don't know this for sure, the alleged racist abuse, I guess they were punished for it, so maybe it's not alleged. It was Inter who were punished for that, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and look, in Inter's defense, that was very bad what happened with Koulibaly. It was, a game that there was a lot of exposure because a lot of leagues were off. It was a Boxing Day match. It was the night match in Serie A. I don't want to justify what happened there, but unfortunately, in every stadium in Italy, that is unfortunately a fairly common occurrence. So, yeah, Inter deserved to be punished. They played 2 games behind closed doors, paid a fine. But, I wouldn't want people to leave this podcast thinking this is a problem just for Inter. I think that would be overly simplistic. Unfortunately, in Italy, this is a much bigger problem than that. I personally would like to see Serie A, take a page out of what the Premier League does and really punish the people that actually do the behavior instead of a blanket punishment. I think that has seemed to have worked much better than making these blanket punishments. I hope the tide's going to turn a little bit with that. We've seen Koulibaly went back to San Siro. He was facing Milan, not Inter, and the reception was much, much better. To Inter's defense, they have started a very strong campaign against this, so hopefully the tide will turn.
Okay, that's good. That's good to know. That's optimistic. But I think it's like the managerial situation, there's that. And then the other one that makes me feel like things are a little bit chaotic at Inter is Raja Nainggolan, which is why I think we might have to spend 45 minutes here, because I know he moved to Inter this summer from Roma, but there have been numerous incidents. There have been some training ground issues. But thanks to a leaked phone call or phone conversation, it sounds like maybe that drama wasn't unintentional.
Oh, completely. And
wow.
Look, Inter in Italy are known as Pazza Inter, crazy Inter. They are totally unpredictable and all. And I would say Raja Nainggolan is the poster boy, the bad boy, the biggest bad boy in Serie A. So in a lot of ways, it was a marriage made in hell, if you will. I think Inter banked on the fact that they had his former manager at Roma, Luciano Spalletti, when Nainggolan had his best seasons. I think Inter saw this as an opportunity to bring in, someone that when healthy and when motivated is a pretty devastating player. Nainggolan's still a big name, but I thought in his last season at Roma, despite their deep run in the Champions League, he just wasn't the same player. To me, he's an old 30-year-old. He's had injuries. We know of his party lifestyle, likes to drink, likes to smoke. it's really caught up to him. So as bad as that was in itself, that deal looks even much worse for Inter, because as part of the deal, they sent to Roma Nicola Zaniolo, who now looks like the next superstar Italian player. Has been compared to Totti, which is a little bit unfair. I see him more as Pogba. So Inter for years was made fun of for letting go of Coutinho, and then went on to Liverpool to do quite well. And it looks like we're having a repeat of this with Zaniolo. So Nainggolan didn't really want to leave Roma himself. He felt pretty forced out of the club. Roma decided to go with a new cycle with young players, and the last thing they wanted was having Nainggolan in that locker room as a bad influence on all the young players they brought in. So it was addition by subtraction for Roma, and in some ways they weakened an opponent for a Champions League spot. So I think Monchi and Roma hit an absolute home run with that one.
But is it true then that Nainggolan is maybe trying to orchestrate a move back to Roma?
Yeah, when that audio of the phone call came out, I mean, my first instinct was like, he's got to be the one that's leaked this out. He said he wanted Totti was his teammate and now is a director at Roma to try to help him come back. I think Roma, especially once they saw their young players like really starting to click towards the end of 2018, and it translated to a good start to the season, wanted no part in it. So I think Nainggolan tried, didn't work out. Now he is starting to say all the right things at Inter, but I just don't know if his body can sustain this.
All right, so that's Inter, but let's stay in Milan and let's talk Milan. That's always confusing to me, but I think that's accurate.
Correct.
You wrote a great piece for The Athletic breaking down the Gonzalo Higuain transfer. For those who haven't read it or haven't been able to read it, can you explain a little bit about how that transfer occurred, as well as maybe why Milan were willing to let him go? Again, you've got some time. Don't feel the rush.
So this one is for someone like me that loves transfers. This is really like nirvana, because there are so many angles. Usually on transfers, what I like to say is, there's three parties: the players, the two clubs, often with different priorities trying to make a deal, and that's already complicated enough. But in this case, we had a fourth one. And that's Juve, who owns the rights to Higuain still today at this moment. So, once Juve brought in Cristiano Ronaldo, who was a very expensive transfer, they had spent a lot of money beyond that. They had to move Higuain because of his huge wages on their wage bill. And Higuain wanted to stay in Italy. They found a partner in Milan, who is probably the team in Italy other than Juve that the only one that could really match Higuain's wages. They brought him in. Higuain, on paper, looked like the striker who could bring Milan back to where they needed to be. Milan always lacked that goal scorer that could score 15, 20 goals a season since Ibrahimovic left. Higuain got off to a very good start. Then Milan struggled for a little while. Milan brought him in on a loan with an option to buy for next season. They invested an exorbitant amount on the loan, enough just for the loan. And Juve thought, okay, you're spending $18 million for the loan. You're just not going to see that as a sunk cost in the summer because you invested so much. You're going to redeem him from us. But then Milan started seeing that Higuain wasn't performing that well. And they started saying, geez, is spending another $36 million on him something that makes sense for us? On top of that, his wages are exorbitantly high. So Milan decided, what, this is a sunk cost for us. We need to get out of this. Higuain pushed for a move. So they found, a partner in Chelsea. Now, Chelsea, ever since they hired Sarri, they seemed like a good destination for Higuain, because Sarri and Higuain were great together at Napoli. They have a great father-son relationship. Higuain had his best season. But we know Chelsea doesn't like to invest heavily on players over 30. But then Alvaro Morata really had a dreadful first half of the season, and Higuain looked more appealing. So a deal was reached that basically Chelsea was taking over the loan for the rest of the season. It became no longer an option to buy. It became a vested option to buy, that if he hits certain targets and they make it to the Champions League, they can either extend the loan next season or just buy him outright, which for Juve is really important because they can't bring back Higuain because of his wages. They're stacked up front. They can't have a bench player that earns so much. So this was really a complicated deal on the surface, but when you looked at all the priorities of everyone involved, the puzzle really fit, and they pulled it off. I think in a lot of ways, everyone's a winner, especially Milan. They replaced Higuain with Piontek, who was the striker on Genoa, who had gotten off to an incredible start to the season. His wages are a quarter of what Higuain earns now. So just that's a huge saving for Milan. And Piontek's been off to a great start. Like, we're recording this today.
Yep.
Piontek scored 2 goals against Napoli in the Coppa Italia. One of them was really outstanding. So far, Milan has to be pretty happy. But to me, just because Piontek's a better fit for Milan doesn't mean that Higuain is going to be a bust at Chelsea. I'm actually cautiously optimistic. So you can make a great case that everyone can win with this trade.
All right. I'm very happy that you brought up Piontek, by the way, because number one, there was no way I was going to pronounce his name properly, so thank you for that. And yeah, I watched that Coppa Italia game today in preparation for this, and I was really surprised by how good and sharp and clinical he looked. It does feel like he is a player that Rossoneri fans should be excited about, but I'm wondering overall, what is the vibe around Milan right now? Are people still enjoying Gennaro Gattuso, or are they ready for something else to happen?
So look, Gattuso is obviously a legendary player for Milan. I think for a while he got maybe a little bit of a pass because of his pedigree as a player. There was a stretch where Milan wasn't doing that well. He seemed really on the hot seat, but again, it goes back to easy to sack the manager. Not so easy to replace him with someone better. Conte didn't want to take over a team mid-season. He's still collecting Chelsea's money. He wanted to wait. So to Gattuso's credit, at the end of October, Milan was decimated by injuries. They had 4 starters go out. I think almost everyone at that point assumed that finishing in the top 4 Champions League spot was almost impossible, but I got to give a lot of credit to Gattuso. He was also helped by the other team struggling, but right now he has them where they need to be. So he's a young coach, he's learning, but he definitely has the players backing. And I think Higuain, had become a pretty big distraction for Milan. I like to say he had the body language of someone that received a letter from the IRS saying, open immediately, you have to take action. That's how he looked on the pitch. So I think it was addition by subtraction. They brought in a younger player, Piontek, fits closer in age to the rest of their core. They also brought in this midfielder, Paqueta from Brazil, who's been so far very good. And the other piece is Bakayoko, another Chelsea player on loan there, got off to a dreadful start. There was talk that he'd go back to Chelsea in January. And he's been an absolute monster recently, really the player that he was at Monaco that Chelsea invested so much. So Gattuso had a carrot and the stick approach with him, and it really worked. So I have to say Gattuso deserves a lot of credit for this turnaround. And if you're a Milan fan, you have to feel pretty good about where the team is at right now.
Well, credit to you for the IRS reference, because that resonated with me. I've gotten that letter before, and it was not fun. And yeah, Gattuso has Milan, I believe, in the Champions League spots at the expense of Roma, which is kind of weird to say given that they were, I believe, Champions League semifinalists last season.
Correct.
This past summer, they sold, Alisson, Nainggolan, as we mentioned, Kevin Strootman. That's quite an exodus. I'm wondering, why have they offloaded those players, and what has it meant for their campaign thus far?
So look, Roma, James Pallotta, the American owner, bought the club. They were incredibly debt-ridden from the previous owners. They were in terrible shape. I know financial fair play gets a lot of a bad rap in the soccer community. I actually think having those strict financial parameters is what saved Roma. We've seen plenty of other Italian clubs go bankrupt. In my lifetime, I've seen Napoli go bankrupt. We've seen Parma, who was, such a great team in the 90s, go bankrupt. I think financial fair play kind of saved Roma, and Pallotta invested a lot of money, but every summer he's had to sell players to kind of balance the budget. And I think Roma took the approach that, the Champions League semifinal was great. Maybe it was, kind of a mirage. It's not like Roma was going to win trophies, especially in Serie A with a juggernaut like Juve. So I think Roma took the approach, we're going to take one step back to take two forward. Strootman and Nainggolan were still big names on the transfer market, but their performance didn't live up to their name. I think they were right in cashing in on them. For Alisson, was a brilliant player for them. They got, Godfather offer you can't refuse. So on paper, it made sense. And look, Roma got off to a very tough start to the season. We should have seen it coming in retrospect because of all the young players. But now, all of a sudden, they're starting to peak quite nicely. I mentioned Zaniolo. There's also Cristante, who arrived from Atalanta, has been playing well. They had their homegrown player, Lorenzo Pellegrini. These are three midfielders that could also really help the Italian national team as well. And another player they had invested a lot in is Patrick Schick, who had arrived from Sampdoria the year before, and he was their most expensive purchase ever, got off to a dreadful start. He hired a mental coach, and he's been really excellent. So I definitely see Roma competing with Milan for the Champions League spot. I also think Lazio is in this mix, and also Atalanta, who is a great story in Serie A. So, if you want to chalk up that Serie A isn't that interesting because there's no title race because of Juve, I have no comeback to that. But the Champions League race is really fascinating because all these teams, have flaws, but also a lot of interesting things to look at. And I think it's going to be a fascinating race also because it has implications for all these clubs on what could happen in the summer, which players could leave if they don't. So if you're also looking at Serie A as kind of like the league where you're making your shopping list of the players you want your team to buy in the summer, there's a lot of angles to look at with the Champions League race.
And one of those players I know Daryl has kept an eye on that maybe will get a move. Maybe. I'm not sure how he's doing is Justin Kluivert, who I believe they also brought in this summer. What have you made of him? How has his season gone so far?
So he's been somewhat disappointing. When he arrived in the summer, there was a lot of hype on him. Pallotta, the owner, compared him to Allen Iverson for his ball skills. He had gotten off to a very fast start off the bench for Roma in the first few matches of the season, complained for lack of playing time, and then really didn't deliver. Roma has a few intriguing options at the winger position, but they invested a lot in Kluivert. He was supposed to be the guy. And look, for offensive players arriving in Serie A, it is a pretty tactical league. In the Roma system, wingers are also expected to do quite a bit of defensive work. I'm not sure he's really embraced that. I think, Roma is going to keep giving him a chance because another of their wingers, Cengiz Under, who arrived from Turkey, I think there's a much more chance he's sold in the summer and they give Kluivert another year there. So let's see what happens. He's been up and down, though. So, again, I think next season is when we'll really be able to judge him.
Much more Serie A knowledge from David in just a moment. But first, I need to let you know that today's episode of the Total Soccer Show is brought to you by Hims, a new wellness brand for men. Forhims.com is a one-stop shop for hair loss, skincare, and sexual wellness for men. It's worth noting that 40% of men by age 40 struggle with erectile dysfunction, but it seems like it's still commonplace for people to turn to odd solutions, weird solutions that maybe aren't necessarily going to work. And I think that's probably because it can be sort of an embarrassing topic. You probably don't want to have to go to the doctor. I mean, really, scheduling an appointment for the doctor can be a pain. You got to wait on hold, listen to that hold music for like 30 minutes, then schedule the appointment, then go in, then get it dealt with. Not with 4Hims. As I said, a one-stop shop. They connect you with real doctors and medical-grade solutions to treat erectile dysfunction. That's well-known generic equivalents to name-brand prescriptions. One ED pill, starting with a V, just came off of patent in December 11th, which was a game-changer that allowed them to provide medical solutions backed by science instead of snake oil. Products are shipped directly to your door. That's also a bonus. It just shows right up. You don't even have to leave the house. So you can try Hims for a month today for just $5. We'll get you started for just $5 while supplies last. See the website for full details. This would cost hundreds if you went to the doctor or a pharmacy. So go to forhims.com/totalsoccered. That's FORHIMS.com/totalsoccered. All one word, forhims.com/totalsoccered. A link will be in the show notes. But thank you to Hims for sponsoring today's episode of The Total Soccer Show. Now, let's get back to David knowing everything about Italian soccer. I am sort of nominally a Roma fan, so I'm just going to continue with Roma questions.
Go for it.
I also wanted to ask you, I guess this is my final one about them. Can you tell us the latest in their, regarding their stadium deal and how that might impact them going forward?
So I love Italy, but the reason why I grew up there, and my wife's Italian, and I'd love to go live there, but I'd much rather work in the U.S. because the bureaucracy, the government, everything is an absolute nightmare. So for Pallotta, it's been really, really rough with the stadium. It's like every time, he thinks he gets the approval from the city and you're like, okay, great, we're ready to go. Then you find out, oh, wait a second, we also need the approval from the region. It's not just the city. So it has been pretty complicated for the stadium. I also have a feeling the political climate in Italy now, I'm not so sure there's a ton of appetite to finally give Roma a club-owned stadium to an American. Now, this is just my opinion. It's not something that I've heard. So, I'll believe it when they start breaking ground there. Again, I hope to be proven wrong. I think it would certainly help Roma a lot to take the next step. For Juve, it's been definitely a big boon to have the stadium. So let's see what happens. As it stands now, the mayor of Roma keeps saying all the right things. But again, knowing Italy, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, so basically don't hold your breath unless you can hold your breath for 7 years.
Sounds about right to me.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, teams 3, 4, 5 in the table. Let's go to number 2. Let's talk Napoli. Have you been impressed by what Carlo Ancelotti has done? They're currently second in the league, as I said. I think 11 points off Juve, but as you said, that's kind of not that surprising given what Juve have done. So how would you rate what Carlo Ancelotti has done so far with Napoli?
So, and today is a little bit rough because they were eliminated from the Coppa Italia, and that could have been a pretty good target for them because they really want to lift trophies. So, what's interesting to me is last season, Napoli with Sarri, they went all in for Serie A. I think they saw Bonucci leave Juve, although he's back now. Back then, they saw, okay, Bonucci's gone. Juve has maybe won a lot. Maybe they're focused more on the Champions League. They made an enormous sacrifice to keep all their core players. Sarri had been there, long enough to really teach them the system. So they went all in for Serie A. They get mocked a lot for that, but they did get to 91 points, which, is more points than Juve had on 3 times they won the title on this 7-year stretch. So this season, Napoli with Ancelotti took a very different approach. They're like, you know what? Let's try focusing on the other competitions, especially because not only did Bonucci return to Juve, they also added Ronaldo. So they were like, let's look more at the other competitions. They were in a group of death in the Champions League. I think for the most part, they did really well. The loss to Liverpool in the last match, that was disappointing. Maybe even more so was them not winning against PSG when they were in France and they had them on the ropes. But, okay there. I think they have a legitimate shot at the Europa League now, especially now that they're out of the Coppa Italia. What I have liked about Ancelotti is he took not only in the objectives, which, that was really more decided by the club, but he took a very different approach than Sarri, who Chelsea fans now have really seen is very stubborn with his lineup and the formation and the style of play. Like Sarri, has his 11, 12, 13 guys and his style of play, and that's it. Ancelotti took a very different approach. I think the first 12 matches of the season, he had a different lineup every time. Different formations as well. Napoli has done a great job scouting and finding a lot of exciting young players, mainly abroad. Ancelotti's been playing a lot of them. So I like what he's done. It makes a lot of sense to me. But now the pressure's really on in the Europa League. I feel like now Napoli kind of has to take the approach that they did with Serie A last season and really put almost all their efforts in this. I think they have a big enough cushion that they don't have to worry about, not finishing in the top 4 in Serie A, and also a deep run in the Europa League. Even if they don't win it, at least making semifinal or the final is going to help them in their coefficient ranking. So next season in the Champions League, they don't find themselves in the condition of being in another group of death. So I like what Ancelotti's done, but now it's really time for him to get some results. But in Europe, he has a great track record, so that makes sense to me too.
All right, so if listeners like to wager, maybe go through a few bucks on Napoli to make it to the Europa League final.
Yeah, and
right.
Look, how exciting would it be if they face Sarri and Higuain, their former player, in the final? That would be pretty fantastic.
David Amoyal, building narratives. I like it. One more Napoli question. We mentioned Kalidou Koulibaly earlier. I may be butchering that pronunciation. I apologize. Pretty okay? Decent?
No, very good.
All right.
Good.
All right, I'll take it. Thank you. He's been linked with, similar to like Inter Milan, he's been linked with everybody in the world. I'm wondering, it seems like he's probably not going to move this window. If he does move this summer, where do you think makes the most sense, and why is it that so many clubs seem to be all about Koulibaly?
So look, I don't watch too many leagues. I only really follow Serie A extremely closely. I watch other leagues, so I can't really tell you, compared to other leagues and all. But to me, in Serie A, he is the best defender. Has been for 2-3 years. I think in a big game, you'd probably take Chiellini still today. But over the course of a season, there's no defender I'd rather have than Koulibaly. Just a specimen physically, has improved his ball distribution, has amazing positioning. I think as a one-on-one defender, he's really tough to beat. Benitez discovered him. Sarri really, really groomed him. And I think Ancelotti is now even taking him to a whole other point. So you're really getting the complete package with him. I think if he were to be sold, a good bet would be him breaking the transfer record for Van Dijk, his ability, but also because Napoli are really great at playing hardball. They just don't let players go if they don't want to. Higuain was really an exception because he had an exit clause that was so high. They never expected anyone, never mind Juve, to pay it. Jorginho left, but that's because they thought he wasn't as important without Sarri, and they got a great return on that. So I think it would really take for Koulibaly to push to leave. And look, if Napoli doesn't win anything this season, maybe he could. I know a lot of people have thought that, what happened with the racist incidents would make him even more likely to leave, him wanting to leave. But it kind of... Interestingly, it almost had the opposite effect. The way the city of Napoli rallied around him after that happened. The Napoli as a team suffers in Italy what we call territorial discrimination. They get, made fun of. It's a pretty horrible chance. So I think they could really identify with his struggle. And Koulibaly, recently got an extension. He's the highest paid player, defender in Serie A. So I would really have to come for him to push to leave. If he does, it would almost certainly be at a Premier League club. I could see Manchester United makes a lot of sense for him. But I definitely expect, the starting bid to be, I would say, around 100 million euro. And actually, although he's 27 going on 28, really worth it. He's a complete difference maker. The other factor in this is Napoli could also sell Allan, their excellent box-to-box midfielder. He was heavily linked to PSG in the January window. I'm not sure if they'd sell both. I think Napoli would rather let Allan go because they've shown they've done incredibly well at discovering great midfielders, defenders a little bit tough, but definitely one to watch. There's no doubt Koulibaly is going to be a name you're going to hear all the time in the summer. I knew there was no way he was going to be sold in January again because Napoli wants to do well in the Europa League, but there's definitely a lot of appetite for him.
That makes sense to me. And your point about Napoli being sort of disrespected by the rest of Italy also resonates because I'm a Sopranos fan, and I fondly remember Furio, the Italian mobster, coming over just ranting about the North and not being a big fan. So It stands out. And I'm guessing he probably wouldn't love, given that he's not a big fan of the Northern Italy, he would not love the team we're about to talk about, because I think we probably have to talk about Juventus at some point.
Sure.
I'm finding myself not entirely excited to talk about Juve. I think it's because since the Ronaldo signing, and even maybe before, it always felt like they were going to cruise to yet another title this season for reasons we've already discussed on the show. But I'm wondering, what about the Champions League? They've got Atleti next round. Are you anticipating a deep run for Juve?
Look, I think right now for Juve, even before Ronaldo arrived, when you win 7 titles in a row domestically, they've become like Bayern Munich and PSG, where basically you really judge their season on how they do in the Champions League, and then you add to that Ronaldo, and when you bring in Ronaldo for 100 million at his age, you can't hide anymore. It has to be the target. And look, I always like to say that Juve is the biggest provincial club in the world, and people take that as an insult, and maybe it is a little bit, but Juve has always been focused domestically a lot more. I think even more so after the Calciopoli scandal. They feel like they need to, in some ways, punish the other teams on the pitch by dominating. They've set the goal of winning 10 titles in a row in Serie A, and now, if you had to bet now, that looks pretty likely. But after Ronaldo arrived, there was no more hiding. They said, the Champions League is our objective. And, I have to tell you, I thought Atletico Madrid was probably in a lot of ways the worst draw they could have had, because they're very similar teams, very defensive-minded, pragmatic teams. When you look at Juve this season, in a lot of ways is the perfect storm. Not only do you add Ronaldo, you have Real Madrid, Bayern Munich having down seasons. Neymar now might be out for a while. Now everything really is set up for them to do well. But Atletico Madrid could really be tough on them, especially now that Bonucci is hurt. We don't know if he's going to come back in time. It sounds like they're pretty optimistic. And that becomes even more of a issue because Juve just sold their backup center back, Mehdi Benatia, who's, I would say, is their second best pure defender after Chiellini. Bonucci is more of a distribution type center back. Now, he left for Qatar. They really need Bonucci to come back. So it's a very interesting campaign for Juve in the Champions League. For them, on the bright spot is compared to last year when they had to fend off a very, very strong Napoli. They could really completely just focus on that and rest a lot of their players before the matches. So to me, it's really Champions League or bust for them at this point.
So if they're vulnerable at center back and they maybe need to strengthen there, I'm curious. I know it's unlikely to happen. What type of number, what offer would it take for Napoli to sell Koulibaly to Juventus?
I think after Higuain, there's really no price they would even consider. And I think Koulibaly wouldn't even go for that. I think Napoli with Koulibaly is like, if you leave, you're going to go abroad. Now, Juve did bring back in Martin Caceres, who was at the club twice. He's been injury prone. I think, now they have a young center back, Daniele Rugani, who's been linked to Chelsea. He's been an up-and-coming Italian defender for a while. Now this is really his chance. Allegri usually only starts him against the bottom teams in the table in Serie A. I don't think he's ever started a big Champions League match. But now it's really, his opportunity to make a name for himself if Bonucci doesn't come back in time. I think now Juve is going to go with what they have at center back. But if I'm a Juve fan, you got to hope Bonucci comes back, because I wouldn't trust Rugani in a big Champions League match.
All right. So defense seems like maybe a little bit sorted, but still some question marks. Up top, obviously, Ronaldo is there. And I honestly think, I was trying to figure out why Daryl and I haven't covered Serie A as much this season, this campaign, because usually we kind of spread it around and do a little bit more when we do our weekend reviews. And I really think, I haven't talked to him about this, but I really do feel like a big part of it is Ronaldo and the allegations against him. And it feels like to cover Juve, you kind of have to talk about that because it's pretty serious and it's pretty damning. So I'm wondering if you can discuss the latest developments there, or maybe how it's been covered by the Italian media.
Look, this goes back to, Italy being a very different place than the U.S. And I think, what we see in England, basically, the way soccer is covered here in the U.S. and society is very different in Italy. I think the Italian press was incredibly reticent to cover this story at all when it first emerged in their Spiegel and when there was talk here in the U.S. about it. If you read the Italian papers, you would have barely even known this was happening. And, I'm not totally surprised because of the culture in Italy and also because of Juve's influence, on the media and the country as a whole. And also, I think, with Ronaldo arriving, one of the reasons why he left Real Madrid is he felt the club wasn't backing him with his tax scandals and whatnot. So maybe, there was also a desire to not make a big deal out of this. But this changed when Juve sent a tweet backing Ronaldo, which was a very unfortunate tweet basically saying, yeah, he's a great professional. We're very impressed with him. And these allegations happened a long time ago. I mean, it was really, not just the standards of the U.S., but really any standard outside of Italy. Well, look, maybe that's not totally fair. But in Italy, I could see how that played one way and differently there. But ever since that happened, there's been, the media did start talking about this. Obviously, we live in the age of social media and, news travels a lot faster than it did in the past. So it has been covered more and more. But again, I think Juve, for years they wanted to have a player like Ronaldo. He finally arrives, a player that's complained he hasn't been getting the support. So maybe they used this influence to shadow this a little bit. I think Ronaldo's been a big hit on the pitch for Juve, but off of it definitely has maybe not brought the attention that they were hoping.
That sounds about right to me. And since we're talking about off the pitch, let's leave him off this conversation for a sec. Let's talk about this instead, because I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on, like, Juve. It seems to me are sort of like the kings of the free transfer. I think they maybe have cemented that title with the signing or possible signing of Aaron Ramsey, but that's how they got Emre Can, Sami Khedira. I think Barzagli, I could be wrong there, Kingsley Coman a few years back. So I'm wondering, how is it that Juve, like why did they make this choice to pursue those types of players? And then how is it that they've become so successful at doing it?
So I think, it really started with Pirlo. Barzagli, right?
It was kind of a free. It
was kind of a free transfer, but I think Pirlo was really the signature one. And Pirlo at Milan was injury prone. A lot of people thought he was done as a player. Milan offered him just a 1-year contract. Juve was really, really struggling at the time. This was the summer that Antonio Conte had arrived. As Conte liked to constantly remind people, he arrived after Juve finished in 7th place back-to-back years. Pirlo was such a home run for Juve. I think Conte was instrumental in getting him going. Again, that Juve was like, geez, we struck gold with Pirlo shortly after they signed Paul Pogba on essentially a free transfer as well. Then they continued with Khedira, as you said, Emre Can and Ramsey is next. I think, the reason Juve has done this is twofold. For one, Juve, after the Calciopoli scandal that sent them back to the second division for the first time in their history, they had to really rebuild their finances. So they were very cautious. They were always looking for ways to improve the team without spending a lot. So it was the Bosman, what people call free transfers, Bosman signings, and then loans with option to buy. They were patient with that. And then they started, so it was kind of a necessity to do it that way. And then they developed a great network with agents. I think Juve is one club that, really focuses on this. Mino Raiola, who is Pogba's agent, he brought him to Juve essentially for free. He helped them keep him there. And when he was sold to Manchester United, he was rewarded with, 25 to 30 million euro in commissions.
That's
for
decent,
that.
Decent amount.
Yeah, not a bad payday, right? So I think, they've done this a lot. And even Emre Can, they invested, although they didn't have to pay Liverpool, they had to pay his agent 16 million over 2 years. And I think Ramsey, you're going to see something somewhat similar. So Juve is just not afraid to do these types of deals. There are other clubs that just won't. Inter, as an example, they just won't do business with Raiola. It's kind of a policy. Juve, I think in one of their last fiscal years, like they did put on their balance sheet like what they paid in agent commissions, and I think it was over 40 million just 1 year. So this is how they do it, and it's not surprising that Juve's former CEO, executive director Beppe Marotta, he went to Inter, and shortly after they signed Godin on one of these deals. So I think more clubs are starting to warm up to what these deals are all about.
All right, that makes sense to me. And then it also makes sense that Juve, it seems like, in addition to signing some free transfers, signing some big money transfers, it seems like they're also pretty focused on development. I say that because I counted, I think they have like roughly, if not exactly, 35 players out on loan. I'm wondering, how is that possible, or is that somewhat standard for them to just have tons of players on loan at any given moment?
Well, look, to me, these are seen more as investments, these young players. To me, Juve, and again, this isn't just Juve because Inter does this a lot. Like Inter, the reason they've been able to meet their financial fair play parameters without selling any significant players by selling all their youth team players. Like Inter has the best youth team system in Italy. Juve, on the other hand, what they do is they buy a lot of young players for cheap. They groom them, then sell them for bigger profits. They have a lot. I always like to say a lot of times you shouldn't look at transfer deals like in a vacuum. You should look if teams do multiple, signings between them, like Juve and Genoa do a lot of signings. Juve does a lot of business with Bologna. Juve does a lot of business with Sassuolo. In a lot of ways, one deal, it's like, okay, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. So I think, of those 35 players that are out there, I would be shocked if maybe more than 2 or 3 of them ever play a significant role on Juve specifically, but they could be used, to raise funds. Like today, it's funny that you asked me today, they completed a deal with Sampdoria for one of their their young keepers. Audero has been excellent this season in Serie A. They had sent him on loan to Sampdoria, and Sampdoria just bought him outright today. So I think Juve does a lot of these deals. There'll be more of them. They're just really more financial transactions, if you will, more so than transactions that impact the pitch. But hey, these are the types of moves that did allow them to be able to afford someone like Cristiano Ronaldo.
You mentioned a goalkeeper there. I find myself still sort of surprised that Wojciech Szczesny is still the starting goalkeeper for Juve. And I don't mean that to sound as insulting as it does, not that Szczesny is listening. But it just doesn't feel like that kind of big name replacement that Juve would want. Do you think he's done enough to keep the spot for the foreseeable future, or is that an area where they may try to strengthen?
What's interesting about Szczesny is, people that, like our hardcore Serie A fans aren't that surprised that Juve went for him. I think everyone else is because people associate him more for his time at Arsenal. Like Szczesny, when he was at Roma the year before Alisson arrived, he was the best goalkeeper in Serie A, and he was really outstanding. Juve said, you know what, let's buy him now. He had an expiring contract, 1 year left on his deal with Arsenal. They brought him in for a pretty cheap deal, and they're like, let's keep him as Buffon's backup. Let's groom him here. Let's show him what the Juve atmosphere is like. He played fairly frequently as a backup for Buffon and did very well. Now, this season, I don't think he's been particularly great. But again, it's pretty hard to shine at a club like Juve because you don't get that many shots on goal. So, if you make one mistake, it's not that you can have 30 other opportunities where you look great. So as an insurance to Szczesny, they brought in Mattia Perin, who was the backup on the Italian national team from Genoa, one of the many deals they did with Genoa. But I think Szczesny is more of a complete goalkeeper. He's a very good shot stopper, but he's also very good with ball distribution, his command of the box. So he might not be the sexiest name as a goalkeeper, but he does kind of make sense for Juve. I know they've been linked a lot to Donnarumma, who plays for Milan and is a Raiola client. Maybe that happens down the road. But I think for the short term, Szczesny has done enough.
Should they just instead go for the cheaper option and sign Donnarumma's brother? He's there too, right, at Milan?
Yeah, he is. That was part of the deal to keep Donnarumma when he was at Milan. Not only did he get paid as he's the highest paid keeper in Serie A, his brother also had to get a salary of $2 million a year, and that was negotiated by Raiola, and God bless him. I mean, if I was a player, he'd be the agent that I want. That's for sure.
That checks out. My brother and I have a good relationship. I don't know if my brother would hold out for $2 million for me. So it's Gigi Donnarumma being a better brother than I or my brother. I do have more questions for you that aren't Juve related, but I have one more that kind of is Juventus related. I can't remember where I was reading this recently, but it was the article. I forget again. I apologize, but it was talking about how sort of Juventus aren't, for how big they are and how successful they aren't necessarily one of the more popular clubs inside of Italy. And I don't know if that's true, but if it is, I'm assuming that relates to Calciopoli or maybe their history of winning. But I was even more surprised to learn that they're maybe not even the biggest club or the most well-supported club inside of Turin. Are both of those statements true, or would you disagree with either one?
No, I think they're completely true.
Wow.
So
Right.
I think even before Calciopoli, I always like to say, and this isn't my saying, this is common, like Juve is both the most loved team in Italy and the most hated team in Italy. So it's like, there's no such thing as someone having Juve as their second favorite team, if you will. Either a Juve fan or you hate them. And this was even before Calciopoli. It's because they've always won so many titles. It also has to do with the fact that Juve has always been owned by the Agnelli family, which owns Fiat, the car maker in Italy. And, Fiat, was the biggest employer in Italy for a while. But, there was always complaints that the Agnelli family spent money on Juve, maybe not so much Fiat when they should have. And then, in Italy, there's a lot of conspiracy theories and all. I mean, the fact that, the theory that Juve owns the referees is something that started well before Calciopoli. I mean, dates back to the early 80s, maybe even before then. So that's absolutely true. Became even more true with Calciopoli. Then, Juve struggled for a while, so maybe there wasn't so much hatred. But then, they go on a seven titles in a row and counting. So that changed a little bit. As far as the other point, as you said, that they're not the most popular team in the city of Turin, that's probably true. That there's a saying that people from Turin tend to be fans of Torino, the Granata, the other club, which is a very historic club in Italy. Like before the 50s, they were the most successful club in Italy. Juve is more of a national team. It's kind of like Manchester United. It's very popular all around the UK. Juve is kind of like that. What's interesting is if you go to Juve games on weekends, for the most part, the Serie A games tend to be sold out, although this season not so much because the ticket prices are so high. But if you watch Juve, and because they have buses of people coming from all over Italy on weekend games, if you go to a game there, like after the match, you'll see like tons of buses, people running to the bus to go to all parts of Italy. But if you watch Juve in the Champions League matches on a Tuesday or Wednesday night, it's not that often that it's sold out. If it's the Real Madrid or Barcelona, no problem. If it's like even a team like Spurs or something like that, you're not going to get a sellout because people, work. They can't travel that much. So, well, what you said, as surprising as it is, I think it's more true than not.
Wow. All right. So we talked, I guess, a little Torino there. That makes me happy. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, as I've already said, but a few more non-top five questions, then I'll let you go. I saw in one of your articles you mentioned the phrase Atalanta's fool's gold, and I am fascinated by this concept. Because I have no idea what it means. Can you explain why clubs should hesitate to sign any players coached by Gianpiero Gasperini?
Yeah, look, Gasperini is a fantastic coach at developing young players, a very good tactically. Like when Sarri was coaching Napoli, Gasperini was his kryptonite, just had his number. Really, really great manager for kind of a mid mid-table team. He had a cup of coffee at Inter. He struggled, was sacked very quickly. When it comes to young players, he's great. And Atalanta has both a very good youth team and excellent scouting system. And they've had countless players that did very well at their club, and when they were sold, struggled elsewhere. There's been countless players like that. Napoli signed a midfielder named Grassi. Milan brought in Conti. They brought in Caldara. Now, granted, those guys suffered injuries, but there's really a lot of examples of these players that look great on Atalanta and not so much when they went elsewhere. We've had Cristante at Roma, who they've spent a lot of money off, got off to a dreadful start of the season, and he looked like a clear candidate to be the next Fool's Gold player. But to his credit, he's been better recently. So now Atalanta now has some other jewels, and I wonder if now some clubs are going to be, hey, maybe you're not going to fool me this time again. Another club that's kind of similar to that I think, though, has a better track record to look at, they have a similar business model to Atalanta's Sampdoria, and their players tend to travel a little bit better when they go elsewhere. You know, we've seen Lucas Torreira at Arsenal, sensational. Skriniar and Inter's been fantastic. So maybe the clubs that looked at Atalanta and are now concerned at the Fool's Gold, maybe shop over at Sampdoria. Maybe you'll have a better luck there.
So were you surprised then that Barcelona bypassed both of those options to go after Kevin Prince Boateng?
And I cover transfers on Di Marzio's site in Italy, and it was a holiday. It was a MLK Day when that deal happened, and I woke up and I always look what's going on, and I was like, Boateng to Barcelona. I was like, this has to be a fake account. What's going on here? My first reaction was like, I'm getting trolled here, but then it was legit. And then the more I started thinking about it, there really were some reasons why this made sense. I mean, first of all, Boateng, when healthy this season at Sassuolo, was excellent. He got hurt, I think, towards early November, and the team plummeted before they were in the top parts of the standings. And their manager, De Zerbi, very intriguing up-and-coming manager in Serie A, plays a very similar style to Barcelona. And Boateng did very well in the false nine position. And if that weren't enough, Barcelona has an Italian director called Ariedo Braida, who used to be at Milan. And, he was hired for his networking in Italy. Now, I doubt Barcelona fans expected him. Maybe they were thinking like the Pogba, the Dybala types of the world, maybe not Boateng, but, they got him on a very cheap deal. He also knew La Liga, played at Las Palmas. They got him on a cheap deal.
Forgot about that.
And then they were able to spend the mother load on De Jong a few days later. So, again, I was really surprised, but then I started thinking, okay, there are some pieces here. And then the other thing is I could see a lot more deals between Sassuolo and Barcelona. I think Barcelona, if they want to loan some of their young players to be in a place where they can play a lot and be coached well, Sassuolo is a great destination for it. So again, maybe let's not look at it so in a vacuum. There could be more coming. So
you're saying that Barcelona know more about transfers than I do? I feel like that checks out. You may have already answered this with Sassuolo or maybe Sampdoria, but I wanted to ask you as my penultimate question, which teams outside of like maybe the top five that we've already discussed, like which teams in the rest of the table would you say people should give a look to, that maybe if they're on TV, don't change that channel, watch them because either they're entertaining or they're well coached or they've got young players coming through? Which sides would kind of tick those boxes?
I would definitely say Lazio. We haven't spoken about them. Lazio somewhat similar to Napoli. They're able to keep a lot of their best players. Milinkovic-Savic, to me, is a sensational player. Got off to a dreadful start to the season. There was a lot of talk, this is the typical player, one season wonder. They should have sold him, blah, blah, blah. I think he was a little bit disappointed that he wasn't sold in the summer, didn't do particularly well in the World Cup, but he's really turning it on now. To me, he reminds me a lot of what we saw Pogba when he was playing for Juve. Now the Pogba that we're seeing again for Manchester United. They also have Luis Alberto, very intriguing Spanish player, and they have Ciro Immobile, who's a very good striker in Serie A, has really struggled for the Italian national team. So Lazio, an exciting team. Anyone who watched them play Juve over the weekend, they lost, but they really had them on the ropes. We talked a little bit about Sampdoria. That's another team that I would recommend watching, not just for transfers. Their manager, Marco Giampaolo, is a disciple of Sarri. It wasn't surprising. He replaced Sarri at Empoli, his previous club, when he went to Napoli. They play a very intriguing style, similar to Sarri's, and they have Fabio Quagliarella, who has to be one of the best storylines in all of Serie A. Right now, Quagliarella sitting on an 11-game scoring streak, matching Battistuta. And who would have ever thought that you'd mention Quagliarella with Battistuta? And when I look at the Italian national team, they're starting to have some very intriguing talent, but they lack that one striker that can make a difference. And in the short term, I think Quagliarella needs to be that guy. I think he needs to be the guy to at least bring them back to the Euro, qualify for it. After the World Cup debacle, we can't say that's completely a given with Italy anymore. So that's a team to watch. They also have a defender, Anderson, who reminds people a little bit of Milan Skriniar, so another player to watch. So that's a pretty fun team. And Parma, who made a great comeback. They've had 3 promotions in a row from the 4th division back in Serie A. They got off to a great start. Gervinho's been a fantastic story. A lot of people thought Gervinho was done in Serie A.
You can't see it, but I'm raising my hand right now.
Yeah, Gervinho and Serie A, speed kills. It's not a skill that there's much of, and he's been sensational for them. So Parma is another fun team. Now, they are more classic Italian counter-attacking, strong defense team, but that's definitely one to watch. So I would say Sampdoria, Lazio, and Parma, and also Torino we talked a little bit about. They are a pretty fun team. Again, more defensive-minded. I would say they're the toughest Italian team. They're not afraid to body punch their opponents. Or if you're into that type of style, you'll have a lot of fun with that.
All right. Well, you've given us a lot of great insight, a lot of great coverage, and a lot of great teams to watch. David, if people want to hear more from you, see more from you, read more from you, how can they find you?
Cool. So definitely check out the CalcioLand podcast. We talk about Serie A a lot. We cover transfers a lot. Like one of our slogans is, come for the transfers, stay for the calcio. People send us a ton of questions on Serie A players, who's coming, and my goal is to then make them interested in Serie A. I also do another podcast with Matteo Bonetti, who calls the games on ESPN, called CalcioCast. That's a patron podcast that's more conversational. And of course, you can read me on The Athletic, where I've been covering transfers now. I'm excited to get back to Serie A. It's been absolutely great working with George and Brooks. They've gotten the best out of me there. And then, on Twitter, you can read, I like to also get into pop culture, movies, TV, music. If you enjoy that, not just the calcio, come along. And it's been really a pleasure to be on your podcast. I really love what you do. So thank you so much for having me and to give Serie A more exposure here in the United States.
Of course, it's my pleasure. I'm assuming that when you say you like the podcast, you're referring to me specifically and not Daryl. So I appreciate that. And I do appreciate the pop culture references. You threw in the Avon and Stringer one when you were talking about Raja, and I thought that one resonated very well. So thank you for that. And David Amoyal, thank you so much for taking so much time to educate me on Serie A. It's very much appreciated.
My pleasure. Thanks again. Let's do it again sometime soon.
That works for me.